All right, so now what we've done is we've created our muscle. We either have a fusiform or we have a pennate muscle, and now we have to make that muscle do its job, which is to contract and to produce force. Okay, so when we're doing this, there's three types of muscle contraction that we do. There is a shortening contraction where when we produce force in the muscle, what we're lifting weighs less than our maximum force that we can produce. And so now, because what we're lifting is lighter than our maximum, we can shorten our muscle. It's called a concentric or shortening muscle. And here what's happening, it's the classic way a muscle contracts. Now the myosins are grabbing onto actin, they're pulling, they're doing their power stroke, and they're moving that muscle up, or they're moving the hand up, and they're lifting a weight here that is less than your maximum isometric strength. Okay, so PO is the force that your muscle can produce at maximum. All right, so in this situation where you've got a shortening or a concentric contraction, in this situation where I'm doing a bicep curl, my bicep is doing a shortening contraction or a concentric contraction because it's moving the weight up towards the shoulder. Okay, in this situation, the tricep is not pushing, it's just relaxing and allowing the bicep to do its job. All right, so the bicep is doing a shortening contraction and the tricep is just relaxing. And it's going to be stretched by the bicep, but that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at this idea of the muscle that we want to target is now lifting a weight, and the muscle is shortening and the weight is moving back towards the body. All right, so this is what we call a shortening contraction. The next type of contraction is if I keep increasing the weight, now I'm going to get to a point where I can not quite lift the weight anymore because the weight is exactly my maximum muscle strength. And so now the weight isn't moving, and this is what's called an isometric. So it's iso meaning the same, metric meaning length, and now it's an isometric contraction. All right, so the same measured length. So I'm going to measure the length of my bicep. I'm going to put in a weight that I can get it, but I just can't move it. That is when that force is equal to the maximum force that my muscle can produce. That is when I'm in an isometric contraction. So I can continue to lift weights and do shortening contractions until I increase the weight to the point where I can hold the weight, but I can't lift the weight. And that's when we're at an isometric contraction. So in an isometric contraction, the muscle is working hard. The myosins are trying to shorten, but they can't shorten. And so here, what you're doing is your myosins are all with actins, and all of the myosins can bind an actin because we're at maximum isometric contraction. All of them are binding to an actin and they're pulling. They're just not able to complete the power stroke. All right. The third type of contraction is called a lengthening contraction or an eccentric contraction. And this is when the weight is greater than what you can lift. And this is one of the interesting things about our muscles. Our muscles have evolutionarily been designed or evolved so that you can produce 1.6 to 1.8 times more force, and you can lower the weight, much heavier weight than you can lift. So you can think about it as it makes sense, because if you're running towards a cliff and you're falling off the cliff and you need to grab onto something, you need to be able to absorb that much more than you need to be able to pull, because you need to be able to stop yourself from going over the cliff, and you need to be able to stop and use your muscle as a brake to prevent people from or things from coming at you, much more than you need to push them away. So it's this idea that the way that our structure is, and what's happening here is now every single myosin is interacting, and the weight is now heavier, and it's pushing until one myosin will slip. It'll quickly use ATP to snap back, and then it'll grab on again, and it'll hold again. And so here, every single myosin head is contracting, and the reason that we're getting more force is because what you have to do is you have to almost break the myosin head. You have to reverse it. And I told you that myosin doesn't go backwards. It has to be forced backwards. And because you're forcing it backwards, that takes much more force or energy than it does to shorten it. Okay, so in a lengthening contraction, it's also called an eccentric. Eccentric just means crazy, like you have an eccentric uncle or an eccentric uncle. That's what that means. So we don't really call it eccentric because it's not crazy to do this. We do it every day. Every time you go downstairs, every time you sit in a chair, you're doing lengthening contractions. So we're not really calling them crazy contractions. We're just calling them lengthening contractions. The force in the weight is more than the force that your muscle can produce. And so you go down and you can slow it, but you can't lift it. All right? So that's what an eccentric contraction is. So now we've got this idea of there's shortening contractions, there's isometric contractions, and there's lengthening contractions. So how does it look like if we put it onto a graph? And if we look at this, this is what's called the force-velocity relationship. This is the velocity that your muscle can move. This is the force that your muscle can produce. So if I want to do a really fast movement, I can't lift a heavy weight. You guys all know that. If you want to move something quickly, you're not going to move like your couch quickly. It's going to be something where you lift it and everybody's straining and it's slowly lifting up. It's not like you're going to be able to toss that thing like it's nothing. Because if you want to move fast at a high velocity, you can only work against a small load or force. Okay? And so as we go and we can do high velocity shortening, that's what we call these concentric movements. High velocity, as the weight gets heavier, now the velocity starts slowing down as you go up this. We're up to 40% of our max or 60% of our max. Now the velocity of the movement is slower. And now as we get up towards our max, if we're at 90% of our max, we're going to go and we're going to push, but it's really hard to get it going. But this chest muscle is still doing is shortening contraction because it's shortening and it's pushing the weight away. When you get to the point where you can't, where it's a weight that is exactly at the weight that you can hold it there, but you can no longer push it, velocity equals 0. And velocity equals 0 is this isometric contraction, that thing we called P0. Okay? And now what happens when we go the other way is people, and we use this as a tool all the time in the gym. I would have big, strong football players who would lift a weight, and it would be easy for them. And then what I would do is I would push down on them. Because I know that they're 1.6 to 1.8 times stronger going down than they are going up. And again, it's just because you're taking that myosin head and you're trying to forcibly pull it open. What it normally does is it does this. It pulls in. It doesn't like to go this way. So it takes much more force to have it go the opposite way. All right? So this is what's called the force-velocity relationship. So when we're producing lower forces under our isometric maximal force, then what we can do is we can move that in a positive way. So the velocity is positive. When we go over our maximal isometric force, then the velocity of the movement is actually negative or eccentric because we're going down. So if I'm going to lift a weight that I know I can do 90-pound reps on the bicep curls, now if somebody just walks up to me and hands me 160 pounds, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be able to slowly lower it down so I don't hurt myself, but I'm not going to be able to ever lift that, okay? Because I can produce more force going down than I can going up.